How is everybody doing? My name is James Di Fiore, and this is episode 3 of Blackballed. I'm really excited about today's guests. I have been watching him all the way up here in Canada when he makes his appearances on the Bill Maher show. That's how I was introduced to him. And his name is Nick Gillepsie. He's of Reason Magazine. I guess you could say that he's sort of like a Puritan libertarian, but I'll let him speak for himself. Nick Gillepsie, thank you for joining us here on Blackball. Did I get that right? Or
well, thank you very much. I am usually accused of being a libertine libertarian, so
explain that.
I have a soft spot for Puritans in a kind of theological sense, not because I'm religious, but that's another story. But no, I often get accused of not simply saying people should have the freedom to act, in consensual ways on their sexual impulses wherever they go, or their drug impulses wherever they go. But not only should we be free to do that, but it makes sense to do that. So I often get kind of rebuffed as a libertarian by both people on the left and the right, and even among many libertarians. So
that's actually interesting because I wouldn't call myself a libertarian. I actually try to shy away from labels in general. I have this weird thing about ideologies. I know some are worse than others, but I have a hard time just sort of pinning myself down in one thing or another. But we have a similar problem in that I get as much criticism from the left as I do the right. Mm-hmm. And what I think that sort of signals is that there is a lot of overlap between, say, classical liberalism and libertarianism. And right now, I mean, it must be tough to be a libertarian sometimes, because often it's associated with it's always associated with racial sort of like shortcomings, shall we say. There's a long list of sort of public wacky kind of libertarians. Right. I was a Ron Paul fan for about 10 minutes, and then when he said that we shouldn't have to help out victims of hurricanes, I was like, oh fuck, come on, dude.
I often joke that just before somebody is about to be canceled or the blackface photo is about to be published, they come out as libertarian suddenly. So there is in the United States, there is I think these are very distinct groups, because I think being libertarian means that you are the opposite of a racist in terms of like general kind of cognition and epistemology, much less politics. But there are a lot of these states' rights type arguments or local control arguments that were advanced at various stages in America after World War II were done. I don't think they're inherently racist, but they were used by racists, and there was overlap with certain arguments that libertarians were making. But when I think of the hardcore libertarians, and I'm thinking of somebody like the economist Milton Friedman, who advanced the idea of school vouchers. He got that idea from segregationists after the Brown versus Board of Education, a Supreme Court ruling in America that led to the desegregation of schools. Some racists came up with the ideas of vouchers, saying, let's fund students rather than schools as a way to get around that ruling. But Friedman actually advanced it and said, this is going to liberate poor kids, and it's going to liberate Black kids from being stuck in school systems that are going to fuck them over no matter what. So, I understand what you're saying, and it's a difficult legacy for libertarians to have to deal with, but we do, because our ideas, I think, are powerful, they're meaningful, and we need to kind of keep our side of the street clean in terms of making it clear that what we're talking about here empowers individuals as well as voluntary groups. And I know a number of Black libertarians who are explicitly libertarian, mostly because they fear state power, because they know, as Blacks in America, or in most parts of North America, if you're Black, the state is against you. It's not your friend. So that's one of the reasons why they're libertarian.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that, because I thought about that just before going on air. I couldn't think of a lettered way to put it, but the idea that I feel like libertarianism might be one of the only choices for Black America, just given their history. Right. If one of the guiding forces is fighting against and protecting yourself against tyranny, Jesus, what is a better case study, you know?
Yeah, but again, I mean, this is kind of odd to be talking about this out of the gate, but I think it's
Yeah.
been a failing of the libertarian movement in the United States, and I'm a little bit familiar with it in Canada, but not so much. But it's a failing that we have not reached out more effectively to African Americans, because I think we have, and we share certain heroes, people like Zora Neale Hurston, the Harlem Renaissance writer, as well as Frederick Douglass in particular. I think Roger Williams, to go back to, Puritans. Roger Williams was a religious dissenter from the Massachusetts Bay Colony who founded the city of Providence, got the Royal Charter of Rhode Island as a place of absolute freedom. Also was one of the first advocates against slavery in America, race-based slavery. So, there is a history there, but we have not done as sharp a job as we have in laying out the case for why libertarian ideas, a smaller state that does fewer things and gives individuals much more autonomy, is actually, the solution to a lot of historical wrongs in America.
So right now in North America, well, the world,
Yeah.
actually, we're living in, I guess, what would be called the COVID era. And
Yeah.
it's interesting, the political Pandora's box that it's sort of created, especially around issues like liberty. So I am one of these people who, when I read about COVID, the more I read, I feel like the less I know. It's a fluid situation where facts on the ground seem to change so much, and data tomorrow won't mean what it meant today. But what I find interesting is that probably the most controversial group are libertarians, and it is sort of based around this idea of freedom of movement and personal rights and freedoms being taken away through things like lockdowns and things like that. Is it even possible to know whether or not we are making the correct decisions now? Isn't it something that hindsight will provide? But right now,
and
yeah, go ahead.
if I may, I mean, I think one of the things that happened when the pandemic hit in the United States, and this, starting in a year ago, January, February, there were a ton of headlines in the popular press in the U.S. saying, there are no libertarians during a pandemic. This is, when you need the government to make decisions, and because, this is a kind of common situation, or this is a place where, everything is interrelated. So you need to have, like, a single policy. Very quickly, that turned out to be clearly wrong. And let me explain what I mean by that. Is that we had in the United States the Centers for Disease Control, Disease Control and Prevention, and the FDA, which are the two federal agencies that are absolutely charged with dealing exactly with these kinds of situations. They got to set policy for the entire country, and they immediately made dumb, stupid, and counterproductive choices where they asserted a monopoly on how to test people, when to test people, what tests to be used, whether or not it made sense to make a test. We had people like the Surgeon General of the federal government telling people explicitly, don't wear masks, don't wear masks. People like Anthony Fauci, who was one of the big medical experts that was, in charge of our response, said, what, wearing masks are a bad idea. It turned out in two distinct ways. One, they were wrong in that the FDA monopolized testing, and then they sent out a bunch of tests that didn't work, and we lost months of trying to figure out exactly what was the extent of who was infected. We were not, it was just a disastrous response. And then it turned out that, systematically the government was lying to us, because it turned out they knew that masks actually were helpful in preventing the spread, but they were worried that there was going to be a shortage of,
That's right.
PPE equipment. So they said, hey, they were lying, making a noble lie to people, because it's as if we're, like, not fucking adult enough to be able to understand something and incorporate that into our behavior. More to the point, what we saw very quickly was that a bunch of states, for instance, Massachusetts, which is a very heavily regulated state in the United States, they almost immediately, they had a shortage of people. The Northeast got hit hardest early on with this, and Massachusetts relaxed its medical licensing laws to allow people who were licensed in various states around the country, they could come there and start practicing medicine, whether they were nurses or technicians or doctors, without having to go through all this, bullshit rigmarole. They became libertarian. They deregulated. things. We would have had a better response to to COVID if we had allowed for more decentralized decision making in the early days, precisely because what you were talking about, we didn't know exactly what was right or wrong. And when when you have bad information or little information, and then you insist on a single response, you better be really lucky that you guessed right, because otherwise everything is screwed. And that's really, that's one of the lessons, I think, to come out of the COVID era. The flip side of that too is, the miracles that came out of this in the messenger RNA vaccines and whatnot, that the production of those things were already in the pipeline before. It's a vaccine platform that was already being developed. Within 2 days, within 2 days of the Chinese researchers posting the genetic code of COVID-19 online, the people at Moderna had sequenced things, and they had figured out a vaccine. It took months for that vaccine to get put into the arms of Americans, not out of safety concerns, but out of old-time regulatory procedures that did not increase the safety or efficacy of these, of anything. They just delayed implementation. So, we had, relatively free markets developed, a vaccine that worked. Government got in the way of getting it out and as widespread as possible, as quickly as possible.
Yeah, on your point about Dr. Fauci, we had a similar. Our Dr. Fauci is named Dr. Tam, and she sort of heads up the communications, at least from health officials in Canada. And she did the same thing. And I started noticing a pattern where if the WHO released a press release, it just trickled down to governments and almost was repeated almost verbatim by health officials. And that mass soundbite, I guess I'll call it, was one of the first things that we noticed. And it was exactly like you said. They didn't want us to hoard the good masks.
Yeah.
And then I was like, well, what about policy? Why can't you just tell the manufacturers, listen, direct your products to frontline workers in hospitals, so that we don't have to. It reminded me of when, remember in the X-Files when the overriding sort of idea was that you don't want to tell anyone about aliens because you don't want to cause mass panic.
Yeah.
It was
so
sort of
instead
similar
you
to
lie about it, and then it leaks out, and you create crazy conspiracy freaks, who do more damage.
And then Scully gets kidnapped by a COVID alien, right?
Yeah.
Like
no, I mean, it's stunning. I always think of, for me, it's the end of Planet of the Apes, the original Planet of the Apes with Charlton Heston, where Dr. Zaius, it reveals he's been telling a noble lie all the time, because he knew that apes had descended from humans. And it's like, we're fucking adults. We're independent, autonomous individuals with rights, with brains. And this is something, we actually act properly when given the right information. I mean, America isn't filled with people who, are looking to throw people out of a lifeboat. And, if we had been dealt with squarely, I think things would have gone a lot differently and better, on the margins, because part of this is also, as you were saying, a lot of COVID stuff, we probably won't really know a lot about exactly what would have been the best results and worst, et cetera, for decades, if ever. The other thing, though, that also is troubling to me, and again, this gets into kind of libertarian themes of centralized control or of the government at whatever level telling people what to do. I live in New York City, and in New York City, things were shut down very arbitrarily. And so, certain stores were listed as essential businesses and others weren't. And so a clothing store was not an essential business, but a pharmacy or a grocery store was. And, and then schools were shut down, but somehow grocery stores were able to stay open. And none of it made any sense. And instead of what I think would have been a smarter result would have been to have said, here are the safety protocols as we know them. And if you follow them, you can open your business if you want to. Your customers can shop there if you want to, but you'll be following a kind of best practices of safety and things like that. It's disturbing to me that the government was able to say, okay, well, you know what, you're essential, you're not essential. And like, what happens next? Because this is not simply, it's not like COVID happens and then we go back to the before times or anything. Every time the government acts, it creates a precedent for something that might come next. And I've already heard, or we heard this a lot in the US, I suspect the similar rhetoric in Canada, that This was, in other cases of public health, we may be going to lockdown, we may be doing this, we may be doing that, and then suddenly people are saying, well, global warming is a public health concern. Racism, structural racism, systemic racism is a public health concern. Have we created a kind of dry run, for something down the road that's going to be particularly onerous?
That kind of seems like waxing poetic, comparing a contagious, disease to thoughts that are mean.
Right.
But nonetheless, the one thing that I want to just circle back to for a quick second is that it's kind of coincidental, isn't it, that even though they were operating from the same playbook as, don't tell citizens about UFOs, and then they announced that UFOs are real during the pandemic.
I'm a big fan of the science fiction writer Philip K. Dick, the guy who wrote Android's Dream of Electric Sheep and Scanner Darkly, the movie, the short story that Total Recall, the Schwarzenegger movie, was based on. And his work consistently comes back to this idea of people who don't know if they're human or if they're androids or if they're being dreamed by somebody. We are living in a Philip K. Dick universe. I don't know exactly when that started, but yeah. So you have a pandemic and a lockdown, and then the government says, oh, yeah, by the way, we may have actually been in contact with aliens. It's too much. Every 15 minutes on Twitter, you realize like we're living in some kind of bizarre counterfactual universe.
And doesn't that kind of feed the conspiracy theorists? And I'm not talking about people that question the government. I'm talking about the conspiracy theorists, right? Like I'm talking about the people that think nanobots are in the vaccine so that 5G will read our thoughts. Or
so that Bill Gates now can get more dates since he's getting divorced, so this is all being planned. And one of the things that I write a lot about have been over about the past 15 years is what happens when countries go from being high trust societies to low trust societies. And a bunch of sociologists, economists, political scientists have looked at this phenomenon globally. And what happens reliably is that when countries or societies become low trust rather than high trust, where you don't believe, your government, you don't believe in your businesses, you don't believe in your fellow citizens, you end up asking for the government to control more and more of your life, even though the government is either incompetent or acting badly. And in America, and I suspect this is true broadly of North America, we have been going from a kind of high trust society to a low trust society. Not surprisingly, we expect or demand that the government does more and more and structure more and more of our lives, regulate more and more aspects of business transactions as well as personal transactions. This is a bad place to be. And as a libertarian, and some people find this kind of counterintuitive, I'm not an anarchist. I believe that the government is legitimate and that it has, it should be doing certain things, fewer than it does, but it should be doing those competently. I'm really concerned as we move into an era of low trust. We're creating the grounds for government to do more and more and to do it badly.
Yeah, and I mean, wasn't Reason magazine sort of founded in an era of low government trust?
It was the beginning. It's from 1968. The first issue is technically May 1968. So it's funny. It was founded by a guy who was kind of a devotee of Ayn Rand, among other things. That's why the magazine is called Reason. She believed, the philosophical concept of reason is what made humans humans. But he was a kind of a semi-objectivist, but he started this magazine that hated, in the first issues, you can see, he hated cops and he hated hippies, but he started it in May 1968, the month that, kind of student revolution and left-wing revolution really roiled Europe. But that was the beginning. You can trace it back. You can start the clock running any time. But, basically in the wake of the Kennedy assassination in the United States, certainly, the way the Vietnam War was prosecuted, the way that Lyndon Johnson lied about, one of the great lies in American history was the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which helped amp up our presence in Vietnam. It turned out to be totally fabricated. Things like the Pentagon Papers were, hidden, which was a government history of why we shouldn't get involved in Vietnam, was, tried to be kept secret. Then Watergate, then a series of revelations during the 70s that the National Security Agency, that the FBI, the CIA had been illegally spying on Americans for decades and in massive numbers. It just keeps going and going. Ronald Reagan and Iran-Contra, Bill Clinton's various scandals, the way we ended up in the Gulf War, or rather invading Iraq in 2003. Yeah, of course we live in a low trust society because our government has been lying to us constantly, and only an idiot wouldn't believe that. But then you got to deal with, we need to figure out a way to build back trust and confidence in our government as well as our businesses, which also often lie, and our kind of third sector, nonprofits. In the United States, going back 15, 20 years, the United Way, a major philanthropy, turned out to be running a giant scam. And the Catholic Church and the Boy Scouts, it's like it takes a toll.
So even through deathbed confessionals like Robert McNamara, before he died, that guy blew the lid off of basically every single foreign policy decision he was ever involved in.
Right.
And then nothing happens. The movie gets seen by a few people, and then no one decides to sue the U.S. government in a class action lawsuit. I don't know.
I don't know what you do, but there needs to be, other than producing, increasingly cynical people who then start to say, and this is what you see in kleptocracies where people are like, well, I'm not going to be able to change anything, so I'm just going to try and get mine while I can. And it breeds a kind of self-perpetuating cycle of behavior that undermines civil society. This is one of the reasons why at a place like Reason Magazine, we talk about policies that are actually effective. So, if you want to actually educate kids, especially kids who don't have, who don't come from families or areas where they have a lot of resources, but kids who really need K through 12 education to be good so they can get on with their lives and actualize themselves. Here are policies that work. This is why the drug war doesn't work. And here is a better way to kind of create a drug regime that will allow people to pursue pleasure without, falling into an abyss of terrible abuse, substance abuse or negative behavior. These are the things that we need to be focusing on.
That's a good segue to talk about drugs.
Okay.
I want to talk about drugs. No, yeah. I mean, I am.
It's the next best thing to doing them.
Well, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, after hearing you talk, now sounds like a libertarian credo, right?
Yeah,
it really does.
Or alternative music, the rock era, I think, has ended. So,
yeah, maybe not. I'm a hip hop head, so hip hop died. Hip hop died in the '90s for me, but now, but it's always been there since then. But you just don't hear it on the mainstream, which almost makes it better. Yeah. But so up here where I am, I don't know what the state law is in New York on marijuana, but in Canada, we're like nationwide, we can grow 4 plants, right, and we can consume it recreationally, but the government sells it to us,
right.
And then so that means that most of us get it off of reserves and our old dealers, right? Because the government weed, first of all, it's just not as well. I mean, I'm not going to say it's not as good. I've never tried it. I've only smoked my own weed. But weed aside, psilocybin and magic mushrooms and things like that, the therapeutic benefits that they're just starting to discover now, and the research that governments are allowing to take place. I mean, I can see it in Canada being it will probably be synthesized by big pharma or something like that. But either way, within the next decade, I can see it becoming decriminalized.
Absolutely. And I mean, actually, I think it will be fully legalized because, decriminalization is a good first step, but that doesn't actually legalize necessarily the production and distribution. And and I'm forgetting its name now, but I believe there's a Canadian psychedelic company that has like $1 billion market valuation. There's there is so much interest in the coming era of psychedelic drugs, which I'm all in favor of, because I think drugs in general, one of the things, whether we're talking about booze, whether we're talking about Adderall, whether we're talking about antidepressants or ethnogenic plants, so-called natural drugs, man, as much as anything, humans are drug-taking animals. They're one of the first tools that we learn to kind of use. And I think, as just as a part of being free, we should be allowed to, pursue our pleasure, pursue our insights and our wisdom as broadly as possible. I'm excited. I joined Reason Magazine as a staffer in 1993, and we had since our first issue, and it was a very lonely time in 1968 to be in favor of ending all drug prohibition. But we had been preaching that, and I knew kind of like, okay, well, at some point, obviously, weed is going to be made legal. It still isn't really legal in the U.S. It is, in about 38 states in various ways, but it's not legal at the federal level. I commend Canada for getting there first. But it's exciting and exhilarating to see the beginning of the end of the drug war, but we are also just at the baby steps. I think that the coming psychedelic boom is going to be gigantic, and it's potentially a real game changer in terms of individuals being able to kind of explore and heal themselves or trip and have insights. But it's also people who will never use psychedelics, because in fact, psychedelic drugs have never been that popular. And I don't know how much them being legalized will actually change. I think it's still going to be kind of a small number of people, but I think we're going to live in a better society when people are free to take the drugs that they choose, and particularly psychedelics. I think there's only an upside there.
Yeah, I know that often people cite the Portugal model,
Mm-hmm.
for or legalization of drugs. I think drug usage goes down, addiction goes down,
Yeah.
but also a focus on that people that are addicted to things like opiates and meth. It
Right.
turns into a health issue, and it leaves the criminal world behind.
Mm-hmm.
I got to tell you, it's a psychedelic boom in my house twice a month, and I couldn't be happier. And I see such a benefit to psychedelics. And I don't want to belabor the point, but I rarely get a chance to talk about this with anybody who doesn't just start laughing and making jokes about it.
Mm-hmm.
Because, but I was a candidate, I guess you would call, for SSRIs at one time, and I tried taking them, and I swear to God, I've never taken a drug that's made me feel so angry in my life.
Yeah.
And what psychedelics do, or specifically psilocybin, is that it resets my mind. So every 2 weeks I take it, and it's not like I'm going downhill for the last 3 days of those 2 weeks, but the grind wears you down.
Mm-hmm.
And then I take 5 to 6 grams of mushrooms, and I go to outer space, and I wake up the next day, and I feel great, and I feel like I can tackle the next 2 weeks. And
I'm happy for you. And it's like why that choice should not be allowed is mind-numbing to me, because there's no downside to people being able to access the drugs that help them become who they want to be, be a better citizen. I mean, I don't want to wrap everything into, some kind of cost benefit analysis or efficiency, but for God's sake, if, to be alive and to be adult and to be semi-autonomous, and then to be said, okay, well, this drug is okay and this one is not, at various points. I used to drink a lot. I don't drink anymore. And I think psychedelics help me stay away from booze. Like, I'm just not a good drinker. I've taken SSRIs and they've helped me at various points, stopped helping me at other points. I use psychedelics regularly, and they in a weird way, and this is something that I say to people who are advocates of drug legalization, and particularly psychonauts, is that in the same way that drug prohibitionists want to ascribe kind of magic to certain substances, and when you go back and you look at like reefer madness or something, and you see, the insanity that, one puff of marijuana joint, is going to make you into a crazed maniac. That's insane, but it's also true among those of us who are advocates and users of drugs to kind of demystify them as well. And, and so psychedelics, I think, are a tool, really powerful tool. And it's exciting as hell to be living in a time where we've come back to a moment where they're actually being taken seriously. And we're able to use them more and more. In the United States, Oregon recently decriminalized all drugs, kind of did for personal use, kind of on a Portugal type model. They also passed a psilocybin law, which may or may not take effect, but in a couple of years, you'll be able to take mushrooms or the equivalent at state licensed facilities. This is the beginning. The Washington, D.C. Passed the non-binding resolutions to make the it's what is it, the enforcement of laws against like entheogenic plants the lowest police priority. It's getting there, and you know, one of the things that is fascinating to me about the war on drugs, which is ultimately, you know, it's a war on consciousness, it's a war on freedom of thought, it's a war on so many things, so deeply entwined into every aspect of American life, from foreign policy to education to medicine, you know, you name it, to the courts, all of this kind of stuff. When the end comes, it's going to be more like the collapse of communism. Like nobody really saw it coming. And that time when, you know, from the first pickaxe from inside East Berlin hitting the Berlin Wall to the collapse of the Soviet Union, man, that happened quick. And I hope, I get chills thinking about this. I hope, you know, that we are somewhere in that process. But I worry about it too, because it is going to take freaking years to unwind all the aspects, you know, of the drug war. We have people in American prisons who are still in jail in states that have legalized marijuana sales and production, you know, who are still in jail for pot crimes. We got a lot of work to do.
Yeah, and it's funny because as in a lot of things in the United States, I'm not trying to beat up on your country, but a lot of it is steeped in racism. Like, I can't remember his first name, but wasn't your first drug czar, his last name I think was Anslinger, and he was the guy
Harry
that coined
Anslinger,
and he was the guy that coined the phrase gateway drug.
Yeah.
And it was really the overriding message that he was trying to get out was that Mexicans and blacks would smoke weed and then rape white girls and things like that. Like,
oh,
it was really,
you know, he is the apotheosis of everything that is wrong with the drug war or any drug war, and was an overt racist. You know, and the history of drug prohibition in America is not exclusively tied to race, but it's very deeply much so. And you know, for a while, like basically, you know, the playbook is that you take a substance you want to ban, you identify it with an out group, you know, cocaine and Negroes in the early teens of the 20th century, marijuana and Mexicans. Eventually, you know, it goes opium and the Chinese before that. Then finally, you know, it was kids and LSD in the late 60s. So so it's not exclusively race. Ecstasy or MDMA and kids in the 80s. It's a very tired playbook. And one of the things, you know, I'm a late boomer. I was born in 1963. The boomer generation has a lot to answer for, but one of the things that they may have done right is usher in an age of relative comfort with trying a lot of different drugs. And as boomers get older, you know, and we are played out, man, you know, and it's like, you know, we want weed, we want psychedelics, we want, you know, we need a new drug, you know, to quote Huey Lewis from the 80s. And, you know, that is not a small reason why the drug war is ending.
And I mean, I'm fascinated with the cultural aspects of certain drugs. You know, I like the cultural aspect of LSD and Deadheads. Right. You know, I like the cultural aspect of MDMA and rave culture, or at least what rave culture used to be.
Right.
And Rastafarianism, I guess, in marijuana, or hip hop and marijuana. And have you ever tried to have that conversation with a person that has no experience with drugs, and they're just like, well, it just sounds like you're trying to figure out a way to excuse your drug use. And it's like, no, they go hand in hand, man. It's like wine at a wedding, you know?
Yeah. That's a perfect example too of where, you know, one of the things that we have not yet really seen in America is what a healthy drug culture is going to look like. We've seen snippets of it, and when you think of something like rave culture, the variety of informal and even kind of formalized institutions that cropped up to help people, you know, people who would test drugs at raves, people who would take care of people who were overheating or dehydrated or fucked up too much. You know, when you look at a place like Burning Man, my girlfriend, Sarah Siskind, who is a big psychonaut and in her own space, worked at the Zendo tent at Burning Man, you know, which is a group of people who, you know, at like, you know, the ultimate kind of rave, you know, they're there to take care of people who have partied too much or for whatever reason are out of it. You know, so we see snippets of what's going to happen, but it is like a wedding where, occasionally, some people are going to have too much to drink, et cetera. But mostly what happens is you create a series of ways of kind of moderating and regulating and facilitating positive experiences with intoxicants or euphorics, and things like that. That's what we're going to be doing on a civilizational level. It's going to be pretty fucking great. And this is, we can make fun of like ayahuasca bros, taking private jets to Peru or something, in order to do things, but they are creating a system or and tapping into an existing one, often among, Aboriginal groups and whatnot. But, we're building that world, and it's going to be a better world because people will have more choices to expand their consciousness, to enhance their consciousness, to kind of try out new things and innovate. I mean, it's very exciting. The main thing that we need to do, it's kind of like, vaccines. We need to figure out a way to get the people who are going to insist that we should be going slower out of safety, out of caution, et cetera. We need to kind of get them out of the way. We definitely need to be mindful and intentional in all of this stuff, but we cannot let people's fear keep us from getting to, the place where we should be and where we should have been decades ago.
I agree. And I just want to go back to rave culture for a second, because I was a late bloomer as far as electronic music goes in general.
Mm-hmm.
But long story short, I ended up hooking up with this. I met this guy at a train station. He was there with his girlfriend, and I needed a place to live. And 2 weeks later, I was living with him, and and his girlfriend, and I accidentally moved in with the top rave promoter in Toronto. Right, so I just got thrown into this scene, and I didn't realize before the first time I did ecstasy that I completely lacked empathy.
Wow.
And it was strange because the first time I did it, I was trying to figure out what I was feeling, and it was good, obviously, and I felt really like lovey and conversational. And then I turned to my friend, and I'm just like, I don't want to sound like an idiot here, but I feel so good right now, in a way that is more about emotions than it is about physicality. And when I fell asleep a day and a half later, and then woke up, the empathy remained. Like, it's like it opened this weird window and it just stayed open. And I've been a nicer person ever since. And there are people that would hear me say that and be like, you sound like a drug addict. And I'm just like, I think this is what people would call a success story if it was a pharmaceutical drug.
Right.
Right.
It's interesting that groups like MAPS, which has a branch in Canada as well as the US, and MAPS in the US for 35 years has been working to legalize MDMA assisted psychotherapy. And, they've been focusing on survivors of rape and sexual assault and soldiers with PTSD and whatnot. But the applications are much more broad. And one of their insights into this is the idea that we all recognize that a single traumatic event can really affect people for almost the rest of their lives. But so can a single good experience as well. That's and right. That, we're starting to, this is, I don't know that this is libertarian per se. For me, it is because I'm libertarian and I like taking psychedelics, and I see, one of the things that I'm interested in as a kind of large project is how do you get people at scale to kind of self-actualize and to live the lives they want to become who they want to be. And I see drugs as one helpful tool in that. It's not the only one, but it's exciting to see people taking this kind of consciousness expansion seriously. And a lot of people are going to have different experiences, and this is where when you accept that people are individuals and they have different experiences, it's okay. It's funny because I totally get what you're saying about empathy and MDMA. I've had people who take MDMA and it has almost no effect on them, but then something like mushrooms blows their mind, or weed, or people who take alcohol. Like, I become a dick when I'm when I've drank too much, and other people become wonderful, warm people who then shut it down and go to sleep and go to work the next day. So it's like, what we need is a pharmacopoeia, as vast and varied as as humanity itself, and we'll be in a better place.
I agree. And alcohol, I stopped drinking about a year and a half ago. Same reason. I just didn't like myself. I'm not sure if you ever met Christopher Hitchens, but the
Yes,
stories that I've
I
heard,
was actually friendly with him, but
the
yes.
stories I've heard about that guy polishing back like 20 ounces of Johnny Walker and
Yep.
still being able to be the most articulate man in the room is a complete fucking mystery to me. You know?
Yeah, and it's again, it's this is one of the things I think, for libertarians, as a kind of general way of being. It's like you don't want to be normative about stuff, in terms of like, well, you shouldn't take this substance or this substance. Behavior is another matter, and if you're taking a substance that turns you into an awful person that nobody wants to be around, maybe you got to check your behavior and things like that. But it's this interest. I mean, like, we all like different stuff, and we also all like different stuff at different points of our lives. Like, certain types of drugs affect you differently as you age or when you're under certain circumstances. And again, just like exercise does, just like food does, it's just a better world when there is a sense of open-endedness, of innovation, of experimentation, and of people being allowed to run what John Stuart Mill called experiments in living, because you go through your thing, report back, I learned something from that, and maybe I adapt it. I kind of personalize something that you did and bring it into my life in a way that's helpful, that then somebody else sees and they're like, hey, I got an idea from that. I mean, this is the way it should be. And the war on drugs is, it is racist, it is sexist, it is classist, it is xenophobic. It is such a scourge upon the land. I mean, it makes COVID-19, look like a walk in the park, because we know this will end. And this only kills, 0.5% of, the people who get infected. And it doesn't kill children. The drug war has been going on in America. You can date it, back to the 19 teens, to the 30s, to the 1970s, to the 80s. It's certainly going on now, but it kills young people and old people. And it's not going away unless we make it go away.
And what is it? 4 trillion, I don't know, something like that it's cost since like 1960s or something.
It's who know, and it's one of those things where it's like, again, the money in the drug war is hidden all over the place, because how do you account for all the costs of, in the United States for decades, kids were subjected to, a couple hours a day of bullshit, drug education classes that actually, when the government looked at DARE, the single biggest program, they found it had no effect on drug use among boys, and it had it was associated with a slight increase of drug use among girls, but, so that's like, if it's an hour a week, out of millions of kids over decades, how do you calculate the waste of money, that goes into something like that?
I guess we should talk about Trump just for a second, because
Sure.
Libertarians seem to like him a little bit when he was. I mean, that's a broad stroke statement. I don't know. It's just hard to. It's really hard to pin down like the spectrum of libertarianism. Like, I don't know what that looks like.
And you know what I would say. One of the ways that I've changed over time is that I think when I entered the kind of official libertarian movement, I thought more of libertarianism. First off, I use libertarian as an adjective, and I think about it as a direction. It's kind of a default setting. When you start a computer, or the first time you open up Word or something, and it has defaults. Libertarian is a direction. It's a default setting that it's like, okay, generally speaking, we're going to give people more options and more ability to make choices in whatever circumstance we're talking about. Sometimes you reel those back because it doesn't work, or it gets in the way, but it's a tendency. It's a direction towards more freedom, however you define that. When I started out, I thought about it more as kind of like, okay, here are 10 policy, here's a quiz. And it's kind of like, if you don't score 10 out of 10, get the hell out of here. You're not libertarian, you're the enemy. And I think a lot of that still persists in the movement. It's not, every movement is kind of like that. And I think with somebody like Trump, I'll just speak for myself. What I found appealing about his emergence, it wasn't his policy positions for the most part, because on things like immigration and on free trade in particular, he was absolutely anti-libertarian. I mean, I think for me, one of the basic things beyond kind of pharmacological freedom and, consciousness freedom, freedom of movement across arbitrary borders, whether it's, states within the U.S. or between Canada and the U.S. Immigration, migration, freedom of movement is absolutely, in the holy trinity of my libertarian ideas. And Trump is had the worst rhetoric on immigration in
I've
my
actually
lifetime.
never heard a libertarian say that before.
Really? Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
and the reason why is
then,
because I've probably been surrounded by really shitty libertarians, but but because usually what they would follow up something like that, if a liberal would say like open borders or something, would be like, well, then the government has to pay to like make sure that these people have like a social safety net or something like that, and so they get all caught up in the government costs for open borders and things like that.
Yeah, there's a famous Milton Friedman quote, the economist who I cited before, who said, at one point that he thought that open borders, and a welfare state were incompatible. It turns out that immigrants who come to the United States, first off, they're legally barred from, getting most forms of welfare. When people talk about the costs of immigrants, they end up, when you start boiling it down, it typically ends up being the cost of K through 12 education for their kids, who more often than not are actually American citizens if they're born here. So, it's like, and these are rounding errors, and kind of, the American government is, it's wasted $6 trillion in bullshit COVID spending over the past 12 months. And you're going to, worry about like a kid, who's an American citizen and has every right to a shitty public education, just like, like every other American kid. So without getting too dragged off, but that, Trump in many ways was anti-libertarian. In other ways, it was more the fact of his emergence and of like kicking over. He revealed the two-party system to me as, they were paper mache Mephistopheles, to quote a phrase from Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. These edifices, which, we thought were, made of solid rock or granite or something, were just ridiculous. And so that's kind of thrilling, because I want to see an end to the two-party duopoly, at least as it's currently constituted. Trump talked a deregulation game. He talked in terms of school choice. He was very in favor of that kind of stuff. It turned out, he also talked about reducing spending. Didn't do any of that. One of the things, and this is a lesson that I hope Americans understand, is that his populism, I think it's important not to see him as this guy who just emerged from the swamps and like changed history. He's the reliable, kind of outcome of a long-term trend towards this low trust society, towards people taking politicians as complete horseshit artists, not expecting politicians to follow through on what they're going to do. He's part of an ongoing process, a negative process in America, as far as I'm concerned. So in that sense, he's kind of interesting because he revealed a lot of the fakeness of American politics. And in this way, too, Joe Biden, who's the anti-Trump, right? He ran against him. Joe Biden is kind of following up on a lot of Trump's policies. He's taken forever to get us out of wars. He is not relaxing the border as quickly as he wanted to. He had to get kind of forced into that. He's not changing trade policy as much. So we can use Trump, not that he's good in himself, but he becomes a kind of marker for the kind of rot and fakeness of a political system that really needs a radical reboot, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I almost thought that the policies were almost secondary to the clown that occupied the office. And and you know what? I'm with you. Obama killed civilians in 7 different countries simultaneously with his drone program. Like you could go down the line and come up with like the evil things of every president. And it felt like Trump also kept that march going of shitty things that American presidents have done. But then with even as I'm trying to describe it now, I can't tell if it was better, worse, or just different. That he was so self-evidently unqualified and stupid. Like it felt dangerous. It felt like any moment, he's gonna Forrest Gump his way into a war with China or something.
I agree. Yeah, but it's in a weird way. It's like he was the least bellicose of American presidents in my lifetime, really. So and also take into account.
Sorry, do you mean foreign policy wise?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
he did not start any new wars, and he tried to, I mean, it was fascinating in the United States when he said, you know what, we're getting out of Syria, which is a country that Obama ad-libbed us into. He improvised a line by mistake, and that's why we were in Syria. You saw the military industrial complex in the United States lose its shit. And this was an undercovered story, but one of the American diplomats who was in Syria, he talked about after Trump was, kicked out of office, he talked about how the Pentagon and the State Department lied to Trump about the number of troops, which are, in the thousands, as small, that were actually in Syria. But it's like, holy cow, like, there is a deep state, without getting conspiratorial about it. But the status quo in America is towards having a massive military that is projecting American presence, in hundreds, or in many dozens of countries around the globe. That needs to be rethought, I think, from a libertarian perspective. And I'm joined by a lot of people on the right and the left on that. And Trump, kind of, he was better on that than Joe Biden is, or Barack Obama, certainly George Bush or Hillary Clinton would have been. There's also that moment, where, and I think, I don't know exactly how to process it or how to maintain it, but, when Trump was coming into office, you also had Macron in France, as well as Brexit in England. And without endorsing any of these things, you can say, okay, you know what, it's clear that a lot of the powers that be, this kind of status quo, is running out of steam. And I oftentimes think about this in terms of a long 20th century, where in America, for sure, we are stuck with a Republican Party and a Democratic Party whose identities were based in late 20th century American politics, and they represent coalitions that don't exist anymore. But we haven't yet gotten to the future. What is it going to be? And Joe Biden is not, he's the end of the line. He's not the beginning of something new. And in many ways, he's a cartoon version of what we've seen over the past 40 or 50 years, which is massive growth of government, the government regulating more and more aspects of everyday life, and spending more and more money that it doesn't have to fix problems that may or may not exist, but it's ill-equipped to do. I'm looking forward to that moment. And I do think in things like the burgeoning psychedelic renaissance and the legalization of all drugs, we're getting to the 21st century, but we haven't gotten there yet. And that, and I think there's a global thing, at least in the developed world, in Western Europe and North America and whatnot, there is the breakdown of these institutions that came out of World War II and post-war culture.
Yeah, Trump also talked a big game about globalization, right?
Yeah.
And that's like a magic word among, I don't know if it's libertarians or just conservatives. I know there's some overlap there, but
Yeah.
as soon as someone says the globalists, it's like George Soros comes out of the closet and starts scaring kids
with
and stuff.
fangs and everything. Yeah. Well, and it's funny though too, and it might be different in Canada than in the U.S. In the late 90s, the people who invoked globalization as a boogeyman were the left. I mean, that was the people in Seattle protesting the World Trade Organization and smashing Starbucks windows. Now it's right-wing nativists in America, who had been champions of globalization. And I think we can read into this. There is a massive amount of anxiety about it's clear that the old world is dying, and this is probably always true, and a new one is being born. It's not all roses, because I believe I'm a globalist. I'm a rootless cosmopolitan. I was born in Brooklyn. I grew up in New Jersey. I've lived all over the United States. I love localities, but I also want to be a citizen of the world. I don't see these things as mutually exclusive or even in conflict, but a lot of people do, both on the right and the left. And when you look at a country like China, I don't, I worry about, I feel bad for a lot of the people in China who are being, really fucked over by the government. I don't worry about it at, that China's gains come at my expense or anything, but there is a huge amount of anxiety about, what comes next. And this is something that all of us need to kind of factor into how we talk about things, how we see things, and how we promote a vision of the future that is more about peace and innovation than it is about drawing lines and kind of hardening borders and lines in the sand to say your goods, your services, your ideas, your people can't come here anymore and ours can't leave. That's like, Jesus Christ. I mean, that's the past, and we have to make sure it is the past and stays there.
And also I mean, I don't want to sound hyperbolic, but sometimes it feels like the United States' biggest problem is that they might be on the brink of civil war. Not on the brink, but it felt like in 2020, it felt like, okay, civil war is going to happen in the next 3 years, and it's going to be the MAGA folk against, I don't know, Antifa or something, and then the MAGA folk will kick their ass because Antifa doesn't know how to hold a gun and all that kind of stuff. But
I don't think I gotta say, like, if the MAGA people were bringing their best to the January 6th riot in Capitol Hill, we can all take it easy. I mean, these were the most, kind of exemplary
inept revolutionaries of all time,
who ultimately were like, hey, they were like, they didn't even bring their guns into the Capitol, but they're going to take over the government. I mean, but thank God, I don't think there's a civil war brewing in America, but there is, and I think Trump kind of recognized this, and he didn't articulate it very well because he's dumb, but like, there is a sense in America, I think, of, that we are past our prime, and that, the way I think about it is that we might be somewhat similar to England and France after World War II, where, our time as kind of dominant hegemonic power is fading. It does, we're going to still be we're still going to be hugely important in all of that, but things are moving on, and we need to come up with a different model of interacting with the world than the one that we had through the end of the 20th century, and especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union. There is, and even China can't play, China is not the new Soviet Union. No country is going to be as powerful as countries could be 50 years ago. There is too much technology. There is too much decentralization. There is too much communication. When you have things like Skype and, how we're communicating, which were this was the stuff of science fiction, in 1989, even, when the Berlin Wall came down. Things change. Things are generally better. I mean, fewer people are in poverty because trade is up, not because of foreign aid. And, these are not, the countries and the places and the people who flourish going forward are going to be radically different than the kind of imperial model of the late 19th century or the kind of neo-colonial models of mid 20th century, I think.
So I used to think, and I've been questioning this a lot more lately, that I guess I called myself a moderate, but then I went and looked at what other people define being moderate and what it meant, and I was like, oh, well, I don't mean that. But sometimes I think libertarians have good ideas, and sometimes I think liberals have good ideas, and sometimes I think conservatives have good ideas. And I am certainly not alone, because I would wager that one of the biggest growing political movements right now are the quote politically homeless, right, where they don't feel like there are any of these things, but they can support ideas on their own. And no one has to tell them if they're libertarian or conservative, liberal, or whatever, for them to support it. They just think of the idea, and they think on the face of it, it's good. So, for example, I personally think, and I know you disagree on this, that universal healthcare is a good idea. I think the profit motive in healthcare is a bad idea. But I also think that a non-interventionist foreign policy is a great idea.
Yeah.
And and I feel like the economics of those two ideas can being non-interventionist can fund a universal healthcare system.
You are describing Canada, right?
Yes.
In many ways. So you're just a Canadian exceptionalist, I suppose.
That's true. I think yeah, that's right.
Yeah. A couple of things on that. And one is that I am in favor of universal health care or universal health coverage, let's say. And I think that the best way to get there is through an actual flourishing free market in medicine and in healthcare and in innovation, because, the profit motive is important to coming up with new ways of doing things. It incentivizes people to come up with messenger RNA vaccines and, LASIK surgery and all sorts of things like that. And I think, I don't think it's coincidental to progress in medicine that, the United States is one of the crucibles of innovation, because healthcare providers can make often obscene profits on that, partly because medicine in America is like unbelievably regulated. Having said all of that, and I don't want to get into it necessarily a long discussion about healthcare, It's not always the case that if something is good, the state must be directly involved in providing it. In the same way, you don't smoke government weed because it sucks. You can have a safety net, but it doesn't mean that the government has to provide it at all price points, or it might be better to give people money. I'm a big fan of, in terms of welfare payments, instead of giving people, in the US, we'll give you a voucher for healthcare, a voucher for housing, a voucher for education. Why not just give people who are poor, money, and then let them decide how to spend it? Generally speaking, they're better at knowing what they need and bargaining for what they want, when they have money in their hand. And if we had a freer economy, I think more stuff would be more available at every price point. But having said all of that, I think, one of the questions is, how do we create a world in which people who want to live in a particular kind of, ecosystem get to do that? And, I would love to see in the United States, we talk about federalism, the idea, and actually in a lot of ways, Canada is more federalist, has a more of a federalist system, but where we should have 50 laboratories of democracy where, there are radical experiments going on and people can move in between these places and see what they like and kind of, self-affiliate. And, I wish, that's part of a libertarian project, and that means less coercion and more freedom, but also allowing people to do stuff that you disagree with. And so I don't know where that gets us in terms of having a non-interventionist foreign policy and, universal health care. Or something.
I was just thinking that one pay, like if the U.S. military cut their military budget in half, they could probably fund universal health care. That's sort of where I'm going with that.
Oh, right? But you know what's going on in America, and this is the problem. This is the reality of what's been happening for the past 40 years. Is like the Democrats and the Republicans say, well, you want a big military, and that's a lot of Democrats. Joe Biden is a war hawk. He always has been his career. Loves a big military, but it's like, you want a big military and I want more social welfare spending. Why not both? Because the United States also over the past 25 years has 20 years has completely kicked free of the idea that we should pay for the amount of government that we demand. We have been borrowing money. George W. Bush kicked this off. Obama followed suit. Trump put the pedal to the metal, and Biden is now hitting that out of the park of just like, let's just borrow money, let's create money, et cetera. I mean, we're covering like, maybe 50 cents on the dollar of what we're spending. And why? And as a result, we're getting more military spending and more social welfare spending and more this and more that. And at some point that bill is going to come due. It already has, I think, in the form of lower than average economic growth. There's a vast economic literature that suggests high levels of national debt that go unchecked reduce economic growth. Canada, interestingly, at a point in the 90s, reversed itself. It actually, brought down its national debt and saw an increase in economic growth. In many ways, Canada is a more well-run country than the United States. Yeah, and, it pains me because I'm an American. I love America. You guys are terrible. You're terrible on forcing every third song on Canadian radio has to be by Gordon Lightfoot or Bare Naked Ladies.
Don't even
and speech is bad and is more restricted in Canada. But it's like in many ways, you guys, you're doing something right.
Yeah, well, don't pat us too hard on the back yet, because Justin Trudeau is right now trying to draft legislation to regulate the internet.
Right.
Yeah, he seems to think it's a good idea to all those Canadian content restrictions that you were just talking about. He wants to try to apply that to people like me now.
Right.
Which is ridiculous. Like you're an American, you might conceivably, the algorithm might take this broadcast off the air if the law was already in place.
Yeah. What do you do with Joni Mitchell or Neil Young? Right. Like, do they count as a half or a quarter, or do you amortize the years they were in Canada versus the US?
Once they have their American citizenship, I think they only account for about roughly 10%, I think.
Yeah.
But if you've never heard of Gowan or Corey Hart, then You have no idea what we're dealing with up here.
I know Corey Hart quite well. So
I'm
I
sorry
wrote
about
for
that.
music and teen magazines in the 80s. So
That's right.
yes,
And you dated Alyssa Milano. I just found out today.
I never dated her. I wrote an advice column as Alyssa Milano in the late 80s. And for
okay.
any girls
You
who read Teen
ghost wrote an
Machine,
advice column?
yes, I did. And I was going to say for any girls, any women who read Teen Machine in the late 80s, I apologize. That advice was bad.
Oh my gosh. That's back in the day when who's the guy from that show that's like a crazy Christian now?
Kirk Cameron.
Kirk Cameron. He was,
yes,
or am I thinking of Tiger Beat? Is that Tiger Beat that I'm thinking of?
Well, it's the type of magazine that I wrote for. I wrote for something called Super Teen and Teen Machine and Wow and Hot. And Kirk Cameron bestrode our pages like a colossus. He was the hottest hunk.
You got to pay your dues somehow, so you might as well do it in the pages.
Oh yeah, I look back on that with much fondness.
Do you have any framed teen magazines on the wall or anything?
I don't. They're in a box, and I'm still unpacking after a sojourn west, so they'll be up. I don't hide from it. I relish it.
Yeah. No. Okay. We're gonna wrap up shortly. I did want to go back just because he was my favorite person to listen to speak, and I'm talking about Christopher Hitchens.
Yes.
And you said you were friendly with him. How badly was his voice missed over the last 4.5 years?
Yeah. One of the things that I think is, particularly interesting about Hitchens, and this is irrespective of the content of his decisions, is that he remained an intellectual seeker his entire life. And his life and thought, I mean, he was evolving all of the time. And, which isn't to say that he was wishy-washy or that he blew in, the winds of fashion or anything like that. But he really thought about stuff a lot, and he had a break. He had a very public break with the kind of liberal democratic, apparatus in America. He kind of broke formally with many aspects of the of the British left, but kept a distance from the ideological right here. And I think more than anything, his independence of thought and his insistence on living in what somebody like Sartre might call good faith, that's what's missed more than anything. Because, I don't think most of us are, I know I'll never be as well read or able to, pull up whole
his recall
of great literature, ever. But, we can model, his willingness to go where he thought he should because it was right, and to challenge himself and to challenge the people around him to, think their best thoughts and defend them, with brio and strength and with seriousness. I have in my life a series of intellectual heroes, going back to Roger Williams, this madman who, who wrote the first tract in English for fully secular government in the 17th century, who taught, he was a classmate of John Milton at Cambridge, for God's sake. And he was principled to the end when it cost him friends. People like Frederick Douglass, Benjamin Franklin. I was lucky enough to study with a character named Leslie Fiedler at the State University of New York at Buffalo while getting a PhD in American literature. A man of the left who spent all of his time, really making the hardest arguments against his comrades. And then people like Hitchens. We need people like Camille Paglia, I think, who's very much like a Hitchens type character. That's what we need, and that's what we need to model ourselves on, regardless of whether we're right, left, or center.
Yeah, it's funny. Whenever I hear Camille speak, I feel like my wife is getting yelled at by her nail technician. But there was a pre 9/11 Hitchens and a post 9/11 Hitchens,
yeah.
And I remember I was not an activist, I was not a protester, but I did go to the protest. There was like 1 million people protesting the Iraq War before it started in Toronto, and the only person on this planet that ever made me just go, "Oh, that's a good point," in favor of the war in Iraq was Hitchens.
And I'll tell you, I agree. I mean, and he was totally wrong about that. And I think history has proved that he was absolutely wrong in that all that happened, with the West, ISIS, and essentially the United States, intervening there is that we destabilized the Middle East for another 50 years. We empowered Iran to, become a regional power in a way, it wouldn't have been otherwise. So I think he was wrong about that. But yeah, I give him a lot of credit for that. And I knew a lot of, part of that is generational too. I knew a lot of people of his basic cohort, right, left, libertarian, progressive, who also were in favor. They thought that there was this one moment in time where the right type of intervention could fix the Middle East. And I find that a little bit benighted. I think history never works that way. But again, credit to him for saying what he knew was going to cast him out of any number of communities that he had spent a lifetime building.
Yeah,
and
you don't want to
again,
be
that's
seen carrying the water for the hard religious right,
yeah, yeah.
But he did it with fucking style.
I agree, but there is something. This is one of the things that is good is the the kind of dispersion of media in America is having that effect where you're seeing a lot of people on the left start to break with identity politics. People who tend to be more class-based or Marxist are breaking with identity politics. People on the right, Trump forced, a fissure, like he drove a wedge in the right that forced people to kind of check their premises and start to kind of reimagine who they were and why. And I think that's a good thing. I think, you mentioned Ron Paul in passing. I think Ron Paul did that with the libertarian movement because on the one hand, Ron Paul had this phenomenal message as a presidential candidate in 2008 and 2012 saying, I don't want to run your life. I don't want to run the economy. I don't want to run the world, because in a free society, like, governments don't do that. Presidents don't do that. Commissars don't do that. That was a great message. And it really stoked a lot of people, but Ron Paul has a complicated history, to put it bluntly, with things like race. And other things, and so like he forced a lot of libertarians to, clarify, what do you really believe, and what should the world look like? And I think in the end, I'm an American exceptionalist. I love New Jersey. I think New Jersey is the best part of America. I don't want to live there anymore. I grew up in New Jersey.
Okay. Yeah.
And I'm a libertarian exceptionalist as well. And the one thing though, I think so I want libertarian ideas to win, but I think the best thing going forward, and this is a good moment in time for a variety of reasons, where everybody can, speak their truths, and out of that, out of all of that kind of fog and smog and fighting and bitching and everything, hopefully we'll come to a place that is the 21st century, that is the future, where things are better off, and when things like COVID get taken care of quicker. Things like wars become smaller and more sporadic, and there's more peace and prosperity to go around.
Well, just coming from this political nomad at the time, who probably would have been left of center when Ron Paul was running, there were two ideas that he had that stuck out to me, and one was he wanted to end the war on drugs, and he wanted to end wars, and those are the only two things I even cared about. I was like, I can't believe a Republican is saying this shit.
Yeah, and that meant so much more coming from him. And there was a great moment where he, somebody was like, Ron Paul in a debate, like, you think heroin should be legal? And he was like, yeah, it's like, I'm not going to use it if it's legal. Are you? And, and again, to bring it back to the war on drugs, there isn't a single thing that having drug prohibition in place, there isn't a single thing that it does well. It just makes it more complicated. It creates crime. It destroys the sanctity and integrity of the Constitution and of law enforcement. It injects bribes and all kinds of double dealing. It makes it that much harder if you have a substance abuse problem to get help, because now you don't just have to admit that you have a problem. You have to admit you're a criminal or an outlaw. I mean, there's a clarity to, getting rid of drug prohibition, which I think can be modeled in a lot of other parts of, social activity. And again, it comes to this question of, let's have open debates, let's have honest debates, good faith debates about the world we want to live in and how we get there. And, again, I want libertarian ideas to win, but I think if we're having more of those debates, and fewer of the kind of bullshit ones that we tend to have in places like legacy media and legacy politics, the future will come around a lot quicker.
You and Bill Maher both from New Jersey. That's pretty funny.
That is true. Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you something about New Jersey. The two things that stick out are obviously The Sopranos, which is the greatest show of all time, and I'm Italian. I'm actually half Italian, but when I eat Italian food, I feel like I'm 7,000% Italian. And I went to an Italian restaurant in New Jersey called El Dante.
Mm.
Oh my God. It was like walking into Goodfellas, and it was amazing, and it was so good. And I ordered this pasta because I wanted to seem like I knew what I was doing. Because I should, in hindsight, I should have just ordered like a spicy sausage penne or something like that.
Right.
But I ordered some weird pasta that I'd never heard of before, and they were like 2-foot long noodles and weirdly thick and spirally and stuff, and I didn't even finish it. But I enjoyed. I saw Paul Sorvino in a bar because I had a film festival in his nephew's I had a film in his nephew's film festival, and then Paul Sorvino drank like 1,000 bottles of wine and sang opera for us. So that was pretty fun. Yeah.
That is.
I'm going to end it there. Nick Gillepsie from Reason Magazine, because where else would I end it? But seriously, thank you for your time. Thanks for joining us. And I'd like to do this again sometime.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
Okay. That's Nick Gillepsie, everybody, from Reason Magazine. I think that Dean Blundell, if you're listening, would probably say that is the most reasonable libertarian that you've ever heard speak. I've been a big fan of his for a long time. I'm glad that he was on the show because, it's just good to hear a perspective, especially now with everything that's going on with COVID and, how libertarians, at least in Canada, seem to be drawn towards the worst elements. It's nice to know that someone from that side of the political spectrum, and my ignorance is probably shining through because I'm sure that there are libertarians are just like anybody else. There's going to be great ones and not so great ones, and Nick Gillepsie, in my opinion, is definitely one of the great ones. So thanks again, Nick, for coming on. This was episode 3 of Blackballed, and I'll see you later on the Dean Blundell Show. Thanks, everybody.